Hey, welcome to week 3, lecture 1. Already we've talked about this movement of neighboring that within the church finds its origin in a couple of questions. The first question is, am I my brother's keeper? And the second question that we've wrestled with is, who is my neighbor? And I think in the article that we just recently read in this class and the responses we made to it, those questions were forced to push us a little deeper in trying to understand what is at stake here. See, I think rooted in the human experience, this sort of post-Edenic harmony, right, is the desire for clarity about who I ought to treat how, and how far I must go in treating someone in the way that God desires that I treat them. See, neighboring, I think, begins at the point of how much are we going to recognize the humanity in someone else, embracing in them the Imago Dei. And where on the continuum of relationships are they to be located? And that continuum might be something like alien, enemy, stranger, threat, acquaintance, problem, subordinate, neighbor, friend, or ultimately, hopefully, sister, brother, though I think very few people ever make that into that category in our lives. That continuum is often made increasingly complex by the limitations we establish surrounding the other. Limitations we've derived from attempts to dismiss or mistreat someone, or limitations imposed on us by the narratives we've heard from those that surround us. First, I want to deal with the limitations that we establish. Our perception of the other is often the product of our exposure to others. The less we've been exposed beyond our family, our village, our town, our tribe, our church, our denomination, choose whatever tightly knit grouping you like, the more regularly we find ourselves prone to limit the humanity of someone else based upon our lack of exposure or some internal bias that we have that we're not aware of. What to us is odd, weird, icky, may just be different. However, our minds seem to want to do something to operate in categories, assigning to our initial feeling of odd, weird, and icky a reason for those responses. So what ends up happening is that we assign an attribute to a person that we've had this response to, so that we can justify why we had the response. We attribute to someone else a trait, a lack of virtue, or deficiency based upon a misperception that we've had of that person. What might just have been different is now tied to something that binds their movement along the continuum to me. They might get stuck at alien or problem or subordinate, or in some cases enemy or threat. Exposure to difference and our willingness to take difference into ourselves without the assumptions of deficiency is necessary for a fair and faithful assessment of the other. Not only are we limited by our exposure to the other, we're limited by our emotional vulnerabilities, by the untrustworthiness of our memories, and by our influx identities. Listen, if your identity is not rooted and you're always in flux in your own continuum, that means that everybody that finds themselves into your life, especially the other, is going to be bouncing back and forth in their own continuum as well, adrift on this movement from, I would say, alien to sort of brother-sister. All of these limitations point to what's called the fundamental attribution error. Now, I want to give you a definition of that. So in social psychology, the fundamental attribution error, also known as the correspondence bias or the attribution effect, is the concept that in contrast to interpretations of our own behavior, we tend to unduly emphasize the other person's internal characteristics, character or intention, rather than the external factors in explaining why people do what they do. This effect has been described as the tendency to believe that what people do reflects who they are. And there's these leaps that we make in assessing someone else, in surmising their character that compels their action that we don't often make about ourselves. And what happens is that when we're unaware of this, it detrimentally affects our ability to neighbor well. So the person who lives next door whose trash piles up, they're lazy, not that they might just be sick. The person who refuses to extend a greeting to us as they walk into their apartment, they're always hateful, not depressed because they recently lost someone that they love. The person who owns the vehicle whose muffler wakes me up in the morning, well, they're irresponsible and not simply someone who's down on their luck who can't afford to get their muffler fixed. The family next to me that gathers regularly and loudly is just obnoxious, simply living out of their own culture, right? Our experience of others is interpreted through a perceived problem in them rather than a circumstances surrounding us or them, right? There's little movement on the continuum of neighboring where there's a refusal to give a benefit of the doubt. The second issue that limits our neighboring as movement along the continuum from alien to brother-sister are the limits imposed on us through the narratives we've heard from others growing up, internalized that we have failed to critically assess. Let me give you a few examples of that. One of the examples I might use is the example of Israel and their tradition. Now, this might seem like a bit of a controversial assessment of the Hebrew Scriptures, but I believe there's critical warrant for this assessment in this conversation. I believe that one of the reasons why Israel struggles to play well with their neighbors is the imposition of limitations placed on this religious sect through the mythic interpretation of the origin stories of their neighbors. Let me give you an example. The neighbors' originating stories, they always begin with some sense of alienation or the result of some perverse or humiliating story. For instance, the descendants of Ishmael come from the family line of a rejected handmaiden who's treated poorly and cast aside. The descendants of Esau, the Edomites, come from one who allows his fleshly appetite to abandon his birthright and whose marriage of the other contaminates the bloodline. The descendants of Ham, the Canaanites, come from the one who's gazed on the nakedness of their father, highlighting an immodest and brash behavior. These become the people surrounding the people of Israel. Their identities have already been affixed to stories that box them in and limit them based on the ways in which stories are remembered and passed down throughout the ages. When stories are internalized, neighbors are already viewed as unscrupulous, impious, perverse, and problems, threats to purity, right? The Jewish people will later do this to the Samaritans as well. Affixing someone's identity through mythic and perverse stories is a way of guaranteeing the justification for mistreatment later. Still today, we do the same thing. We tend to allow the imposed mythic limitations of narratives told to us by others to keep us from experiencing the others in their uniqueness. We've already located them, fixed them on the continuum of relationships of acceptability, like how much are we going to let them move and get close enough to us. Once we've allowed these limitations told to us by our parents, authorities, pastors, churches, news media, to locate a person or a group of people in a category that makes the brother-sister question unnecessary, we move to justification of necessary exclusion. Such limitations already sow the seed of the answer to the questions, am I my brother's keeper? No, if I don't see myself as their brother. Who is my neighbor? Not them. You've heard about them, what they do, and where they come from. Neighboring that fails to take seriously the limitations of the fundamental attribution error and narrative construction will enter into relationships already exposed to the attitudes of superiority and judgment. For the church to neighbor well, we must recognize that our limits bind possibilities. And likewise, we who listen to the agenda in telling us the narratives that limit us must learn how to run those through a faithful, critical lens, right? And in lecture 2 this week, we're going to talk about the movements of neighboring as we talk about walls and boundary markers and erasing of lines. But understand that all of that is within the continuum of movement of people from alien, hopefully, as we learn to understand them as brothers and sisters.